Chapter 1. The hearing was supposed to last a single day. That was what the Galactic Arbitration Bureau had scheduled. One formal session, a review of evidence, a statement from the accused, and a resolution approved by committee vote. The humans had been accused of trade violations. Nothing unusual, nothing that hadn't happened before with dozens of younger species. No one expected complications. They certainly did not expect the humans to agree with the charges. Ambassador Helen Cross stood alone on the circular platform at the center of the chamber. She was smaller than most of the delegates surrounding her, softer in appearance, her dark suit unadorned by symbols of rank or power. She did not project authority the way older species did. She did not need to. "We acknowledge the violations," she said calmly, her voice carrying through the translators without distortion. "Every one of them." The chamber stirred. Several delegates exchanged glances. The Vyarch's combine rippled with amusement. The Talari Synod adjusted their posture in what their species considered polite surprise. Confessions were rare at this stage. Appeals were expected. Denials, procedural challenges. Admission was inconvenient. "You admit," the High Arbiter said slowly, his crystalline form pulsing with faint light, "that humanity knowingly violated Union trade restrictions on restricted energy systems." "Yes." "And that you failed to submit inspection access to your industrial facilities." "Yes." "And that you expanded economic influence into regions explicitly marked as non-aligned." "Yes." A murmur spread. The Arbiter paused. "Then you understand that the penalty matrix is clear." Ambassador Cross nodded. "We have reviewed it extensively. You are aware," the Arbiter continued, "that cumulative violations of this magnitude permit sanctions up to and including economic isolation, territorial restriction, and under extreme circumstances, forced withdrawal from Union space." "Yes," she said again. The Cathari delegation clicked their mandibles in satisfaction. For years they had argued that humans were disruptive, too curious, too independent, too unwilling to accept the unspoken hierarchies that governed galactic society. This was the moment they had waited for, the moment the rules would finally be enforced. "Very well," the Arbiter said. "The Council will recess for deliberation." The recess lasted 3 hours. When the delegates returned, the chamber felt different, quieter, heavier. "The ruling," the Arbiter announced, "is unanimous." The words that followed echoed through human history for generations. Humanity is hereby expelled from the Galactic Union. All human-controlled worlds are to be vacated within 30 standard cycles. All trade privileges are revoked, all treaties nullified. The chamber waited. Every species that had ever been sanctioned had reacted the same way. Outrage, panic, pleading, threats, sometimes violence. Ambassador Cross simply inclined her head. "We accept." Silence crashed down like a physical force. "You accept?" the Arbiter asked, his crystalline structure flickering in visible confusion. "Yes," she said, "we will comply fully." "You will be alone," one delegate snapped. "Your supply chains will collapse, your colonies will fail." "Perhaps," Cross replied evenly. "Or perhaps we will adapt. We usually do." She gathered her documents. "This session is concluded from our perspective," she added. "Thank you for your time." As she stepped off the platform, something subtle rippled through the chamber. Not fear yet, but the first uncomfortable realization that the humans had not reacted as expected. On Earth, the message arrived 40 seconds later. In a control room buried beneath kilometers of reinforced stone, Admiral Jonah Reyes read the verdict without visible reaction. Around him, officers waited for orders, tension tight in their posture. 30 cycles, one of them said quietly. "They think that's enough to break us." Reyes allowed himself a thin smile. "They always do." He tapped a control on his console, unlocking a file that had not been opened in public channels for decades. "Begin Phase 1, he said. Across human space, alarms did not sound. There were no emergency broadcasts, no speeches, no declarations of outrage. Instead, something far stranger happened. Humanity began to pack. Chapter 2, humanity did not argue with the verdict. That alone unsettled the Union more than any protest ever could. Within days of the expulsion announcement, Union monitoring stations began reporting strange but technically compliant behavior across human-controlled space. Trade lanes were cleared without incident. Military patrols reduced their presence instead of reinforcing it. Human embassies closed quietly, staff departing with polite farewells and no attempts at negotiation. The Cathari interpreted this as capitulation. The older species were not so certain. They noticed the timelines. 30 cycles was a generous grace period by Union standards. It was meant to provide time for appeals, for desperation to set in, for leverage to be applied. It assumed dependency. It assumed fragility. The humans treated it as a deadline. Shipyards that had once produced civilian transports shifted to round-the-clock operation. Not military hulls, those would have been flagged immediately, but modular frames, adaptable vessels capable of being repurposed in dozens of configurations. Mining operations intensified, stripping entire asteroid belts with an efficiency that alarmed even human economists. Union inspectors filed reports noting the activity but found no violations. Every action fell within the letter of the sanctions. Humanity was not hoarding weapons. It was not mobilizing fleets. It was reallocating. On Earth, Admiral Reyes convened a closed session with representatives from logistics, infrastructure, and long-term planning. No politicians were present. This was not a meeting about optics. "This is not an evacuation," Reyes said bluntly. "It's a migration." Several heads lifted at that. "We're not pulling back and waiting," he continued. "We're moving forward, away from oversight, away from bottlenecks, away from anyone who thinks they can turn our survival into a bargaining chip." A logistics officer frowned. "Sir, that scale of relocation has been modeled for decades," Reyes finished. "We just never expected to trigger it this way." The files he authorized that day were old. Contingency plans written during humanity's earliest interstellar years, when they had still feared what would happen if the galaxy decided they were inconvenient. Distributed settlement frameworks, autonomous supply webs, self-sufficient industrial seeds designed to operate without centralized support. At the time, many had called the plans paranoid. Now they were simply prepared. Union surveillance struggled to keep up. Human convoys did not flee en masse. They moved in layers. Infrastructure was dismantled in ways that left nothing critical behind. Entire colonies were depopulated without panic, residents relocated through routes that had never appeared on public trade maps. By the time Union officials realized what was happening, several human worlds were already empty, not destroyed, vacant. "What are they doing?" a Talari observer asked during a closed Union session. "They're complying," the arbiter replied, "exactly as ordered. But where are they going?" No one answered, because the truth was uncomfortable. Humanity was not retreating into known space. It was leaving the map. The first non-aligned systems went dark within a cycle, not from sabotage but from silence. No beacons, no traffic, no economic signatures. Human presence vanished so completely that automated Union systems reclassified the regions as uninhabited, which was technically correct. The Cathari began pushing for accelerated enforcement. "They're exploiting loopholes," their delegate insisted. "We must impose tighter controls, extend oversight." The arbiter hesitated. Every attempt to tighten restrictions required consensus. Every new measure demanded justification, and humanity, infuriatingly, had broken no additional rules. They had simply stopped participating. By the 10th cycle, union trade networks began to feel the absence. Human logistical hubs had quietly underpinned entire supply chains. Their modular manufacturing standards had become defaults across dozens of species. Their departure did not cause immediate collapse, but inefficiencies crept in. Delays compounded, costs rose. The Cathari noticed first, then everyone else did. They were more integrated than we realized, a Synod analyst admitted. They were foundational, another corrected. On Earth, Rays received the updated reports without satisfaction. This was not a victory, it was a consequence, one he had hoped would never be necessary. Any response from the Union, he asked. Nothing official, an aide replied. But internal communications traffic is spiking, they're arguing. Rays nodded. Good. Humanity continued its quiet exodus. The last Union-registered human world was vacated 3 cycles ahead of schedule. Its orbital stations powered down in perfect sequence, leaving behind nothing but empty docks and pristine infrastructure no one else knew how to use properly. Ambassador Cross sent a final message to the Arbiter before departing Union space. It contained no accusations, only a courtesy notice. Compliance complete. Further contact will be limited by necessity. The Arbiter stared at the message for a long time after it ended. For the first time since the Union's founding, a species had not been expelled. It had chosen to leave. And as the maps updated, slowly erasing human territory from recognized space, a question began circulating in quiet channels among the oldest delegates. What does a species do when it stops asking permission? Chapter 3. The first indication that humanity's absence was a problem came from a place no one expected. Insurance. Union commercial insurers began flagging anomalies in risk models less than a cycle after the last human world went dark. Premiums spiked without any clear triggering event. Routes that had been considered stable for centuries were suddenly reclassified as volatile. Entire sectors became uninsurable overnight. No wars had started. No pirates had appeared. No stellar phenomena had changed. The models simply stopped agreeing with themselves. Analysts dug into the data and found a recurring pattern. Wherever human logistics, arbitration services, or modular infrastructure had once been present, systems had quietly relied on them to absorb uncertainty. Humans had standardized redundancy in ways no one had noticed until it vanished. They patched inefficiencies before those inefficiencies could cascade. Without them, small problems stayed small until they didn't. A delayed shipment here, a misaligned standard there, a dispute over specifications that humans had once mediated informally, pragmatically, without ceremony. Now those disputes escalated, committees were formed, votes were delayed, deadlines slipped. Nothing catastrophic, just friction. By the time Union economists realized what was happening, the term human drag coefficient had entered internal reports, an uncomfortable admission that humanity's presence had reduced systemic entropy simply by being difficult to ignore. The Cathari dismissed the reports. Temporary instability, their delegate insisted. Markets adjust. Markets did adjust, poorly. In the outer reach, a minor trade dispute between 2 mid-tier species spiraled when no neutral human arbitration team arrived to de-escalate it. Tariffs were imposed. Retaliation followed. Shipping lanes were blockaded, not violently but bureaucratically. 3 cycles later, the first shots were fired. The Union intervened as it always had. Too late. Meanwhile, beyond Union space, humanity continued to disperse. They did not form a new bloc. They did not declare a successor organization. Human settlements appeared as nodes, small, self-sufficient, and stubbornly independent. Some clustered loosely. Others vanished entirely from any detectable network, operating on principles of isolation refined over decades of contingency planning. Admiral Reyes watched the reports with grim focus. "They're going to come looking," one of his planners said. "Eventually." "Yes," Reyes agreed, "but not for the reason they think." Humanity had not cut itself off entirely. It had left threads, thin, almost invisible channels of observation and data exchange. Enough to watch, not enough to be bound. When the first Union delegation attempted contact, it was not a diplomatic mission. It was an audit. The arbiter himself authorized it, a small team dispatched to a former human logistics hub near the edge of mapped space. The facility had been left intact, powered down but functional. A gesture of compliance, or bait. The delegation found the station reactivated upon arrival. Life support engaged. Lights warming from cold standby. A single human waited for them, not Ambassador Cross, a younger official dressed simply, no insignia. "You're not authorized to be here," the arbiter said stiffly. The human smiled faintly. "We're not authorized to be anywhere anymore." "You were expelled," the arbiter replied. "You no longer fall under Union jurisdiction." "Correct," the human said, "which means this conversation is voluntary." The arbiter did not like that. "Trade disruptions are increasing," he said. "Conflicts are escalating. Your withdrawal has had consequences." "Yes," the human agreed. "We anticipated that." "Then you admit responsibility." The human tilted their head. "No, we acknowledge causality. Those are different." The arbiter's crystalline form pulsed with irritation. "The Union is considering revised terms." "Of course you are." "You could be reinstated," the arbiter said carefully, "under stricter oversight." The human's smile faded. "We didn't leave because the rules were unfair," they said. "We left because the rules were brittle." "Brittle," the arbiter echoed. "They worked as long as everyone agreed on outcomes," the human replied. "They fail the moment reality gets messy." The arbiter said nothing. "Humanity is messy," the human continued. "That made us useful. It also made us incompatible with systems that value control over resilience." "Are you refusing reinstatement?" the arbiter demanded. The human considered the question. "We're refusing dependence," they said finally. "On either side." The station's lights dimmed slightly, a subtle signal. "This meeting is concluded," the human added. "You're welcome to depart safely." As the delegation returned to their vessel, the arbiter felt something unfamiliar settle into his core. Regret. Back in Union space, the cracks widened. Minor wars multiplied. Not galaxy-spanning conflicts, but persistent, grinding disputes that drained resources and attention. The Union's mechanisms for resolution proved too slow, too procedural, too invested in preserving structure over outcome. Humans had always ignored procedure when it got in the way. That had been their greatest flaw. And it was becoming clear their greatest strength. The question spreading now through quiet corridors and encrypted channels was no longer whether humanity could be controlled. It was whether the galaxy could function without them. Chapter 4. The Union did not fracture all at once. It began to bend. The first reforms were minor, almost cosmetic. Emergency arbitration panels were granted expanded authority. Trade disputes were fast-tracked. Enforcement protocols were simplified. None of it addressed the underlying problem, but it gave the appearance of motion, which soothed enough delegates to delay harder conversations. For a time, it worked. Then the cascade began. A border conflict between two secondary powers escalated when a logistics failure stranded relief convoys in neutral space. The Union intervened diplomatically, issuing ceasefire mandates and compliance timetables. Neither side complied, not out of defiance, but because neither could afford to stop. Their economies had become too tightly coupled to continuous movement, and movement had become unreliable. The conflict dragged on. Insurance markets collapsed in the sector. Shipping rates tripled. Pirate activity surged, not because pirates were bolder but because enforcement schedules slipped and patrol gaps widened. Every problem fed another. And through it all, the humans remained absent. Union analysts tried to model the deterioration. They ran simulations, cross-referenced historical data, and layered predictive frameworks until the results blurred into contradiction. Every model that assumed human absence indefinitely collapsed. Every model that reintroduced human-style mediation stabilized. That fact was quietly buried. Publicly, the Union maintained that order would be restored through internal reform. Privately, the oldest delegates began asking forbidden questions. What if the humans were not disruptive? What if they had been structural? The arbiter convened a closed session with representatives from species that had predated the Union itself. Beings who remembered eras before standardized governance, before universal protocols, before stability had been engineered into expectation. We mistook compliance for strength, one elder delegate said slowly, and we mistook disagreement for weakness. No one contradicted them. The arbiter authorized a new initiative under the guise of crisis mitigation. Officially, it was a survey of non-aligned regions. Unofficially, it was a search, not for humanity as a political entity, for humanity as a function. The first contact did not occur through diplomacy. It occurred through disaster. A Union core world suffered a cascade failure in its orbital habitats when a micrometeoroid swarm, normally trivial, triggered a chain of secondary impacts. Emergency response teams mobilized, but conflicting jurisdictional claims delayed action. Evacuation protocols stalled in committee. 30,000 lives were lost in under an hour. Before the Union could issue a formal request for assistance, help arrived, not from a fleet, from a human logistics node operating 3 systems away. They did not ask permission. They rerouted traffic. They repurposed civilian haulers. They overrode standard docking protocols and violated half a dozen Union regulations in the process. They saved millions, and then they left. The Union fined them. The humans paid the fine. The message was unmistakable. Humanity was not returning, but it was not gone. Similar incidents followed. Quiet interventions. Rapid stabilization. Minimal communication. Humans appeared where systems broke down and disappeared before authority could respond. They did not coordinate with one another, which made them impossible to sanction collectively. Union delegates argued fiercely over what to do. Invite them back, some urged, on revised terms. They won't accept oversight, others countered. They're already interfering, the Cathari delegate hissed, without accountability. The arbiter listened to all of it, and then, for the first time in the Union's history, he broke precedent. He spoke without consensus. We expelled them, he said quietly. Not because they were dangerous, but because they refused to be predictable. Silence fell. We believed order meant control, he continued, and we believed control meant safety. He paused, crystalline form dimming slightly. We were wrong. The arbiter authorized a signal, not a summons, not an offer. An acknowledgement. It was transmitted on channels humans were known to monitor, stripped of diplomatic language, stripped of authority. It contained only a single statement. We do not understand how to function without you. The response came weeks later, from no fixed location, from no identifiable authority. A message routed through half a dozen relays, impossible to trace. Neither do we. That's why we left. The arbiter closed his eyes, an old habit from a time before crystallization, and felt the weight of something the Union had not carried in centuries: uncertainty, and beneath it something even rarer. The possibility that survival might require change, not enforcement. The galaxy was no longer unraveling, but it was no longer stable either. It was learning, slowly, painfully, and humanity, fractured and ungovernable, had become its unwilling teacher. Chapter 5. The Union did not collapse. That in the end surprised everyone. It did not return to the stability it once knew either. The old equilibrium, clean, centralized, confident, was gone for good. In its place emerged something slower, noisier, and far more difficult to control. The delegates argued more than they ever had before. That was new. Emergency powers, once temporary and symbolic, became permanent but fragmented. Regional arbitration replaced universal rulings. Some species withdrew from shared frameworks entirely, choosing local compacts over galactic guarantees. Others clung to union law, enforcing it more rigidly than ever, fearful of what looseness might invite. The galaxy did not move in one direction. It moved in many. Humanity remained outside it all, not in exile, not in isolation, in parallel. Human settlements matured into something no one had modeled correctly. They did not form borders in the traditional sense. They created corridors, routes of trust, information, and logistics that shifted with circumstance. Where one node failed, another compensated. Where one settlement fractured, others absorbed the loss without ceremony. There was no capital. There was no voice that spoke for all of them. Which meant there was no lever the Union could pull. Admiral Reyes retired quietly. No statues were raised. No speeches made. He spent his remaining years advising disaster response groups that did not technically exist, helping design systems meant to function even when authority failed entirely. Ambassador Cross never returned to diplomacy. She taught instead conflict theory, negotiation under uncertainty, institutional failure. Her students came from dozens of species. None of them left with clean answers. That, she told them, was the point. Years passed. The Union adapted, not because it wanted to, but because it had to. It learned to tolerate inefficiency, to allow decisions to stall, to survive without immediate resolution. Some called it decay, others called it resilience. The Cathari never forgave humanity. They watched human space obsessively, waiting for collapse that never came. Human systems failed constantly, colonies folded, projects were abandoned, settlements relocated. But the failures never spread the way Cathari models predicted. There was no single structure to bring down. One Cathari analyst summarized the problem in a report that was quickly classified. They do not persist by succeeding. They persist by continuing. The Union eventually stopped trying to bring humanity back. Instead, it began quietly imitating human behavior. Arbitration bodies gained discretionary power. Redundancy replaced efficiency in critical systems. Protocols were rewritten to allow for contradiction without immediate correction. The galaxy became harder to govern. It also became harder to break. Humanity noticed. They did not comment. Occasionally, human ships appeared at the edges of conflict zones, offering aid without authority and leaving without acknowledgement. Sometimes they were accepted. Sometimes they were turned away. They never insisted. They had learned what insistence did to systems. The arbiter, older now, his crystalline form dulled by time, reviewed the historical record one final time before stepping down. The expulsion of humanity stood out as the defining moment of his tenure. Not because it had weakened the Union, but because it had revealed it. He recorded a private addendum, sealed for future generations. We believed order was something we imposed. They showed us it was something we survived. Far beyond Union space, a human child listened to an old recording in a classroom built from modular parts that had once been a cargo ship. The lesson was not about politics or war. It was about systems, about why some break cleanly and others bend. The teacher did not glorify exile or hardship. She did not speak of humanity as special. She said only this: We're not strong because we're united. We're not safe because we're controlled. We last because we don't finish ourselves." The child asked what that meant. The teacher smiled. "It means there's always room to change." The galaxy continued, louder, messier, and more uncertain than before. And for the first time in a very long while, it was still alive because of it.